Hello, art and history lovers, and welcome back to the channel. Tonight, we're embarking on a journey back in time to an era of explosive creativity and intellectual rebirth. We're talking about the Renaissance, a period that completely reshaped Western civilization from the 14th to the 17th century, and we're going to explore it through its most enduring monuments, its architecture. So, what exactly is Renaissance architecture? Imagine stepping out of the towering, intricate, and somewhat chaotic world of Gothic cathedrals and into a space that feels calm, orderly, and beautifully. That's the essence of the Renaissance revolution in building. It was a deliberate return to the principles of classical and ancient Greece and Rome. Architects of the time weren't just copying old buildings, they were rediscovering a lost language of design, a language based on harmony, proportion, and symmetry. This wasn't just an artistic choice. It was a philosophical one. The Renaissance celebrated humanism, the belief in human potential and achievement. Architects wanted to create buildings that reflected this ideal. Instead of structures designed to make you feel small and insignificant in the face of the divine, they built spaces that felt rational, understandable, and uplifting to the human spirit. They believed that a well-designed building based on mathematical principles could mirror the harmony of the universe itself. The story begins in Florence, Italy, the cradle of the Renaissance. And it's impossible to talk about the start of Renaissance architecture without mentioning one name. Filippo Brunelleschi. He was a genius goldsmith, sculptor, an engineer who took on a challenge that had stumped everyone for over a century: how to build a dome on top of Florence's massive cathedral, Santa Maria del Fiore. The space to be covered was enormous, and traditional Gothic building methods wouldn't work. Brunelleschi, after studying ancient Roman structures like the Pantheon, devised a revolutionary double-shelled dome with an intricate brick herringbone pattern and a system of internal chains. He didn't just solve an engineering problem. He created the first great architectural monument of the Renaissance, a symbol of Florentine pride and ingenuity that still dominates the city's skyline today. His work kicked off a frenzy of innovation, inspiring a new generation of architects. One of the most defining features you will notice in Renaissance buildings is their emphasis on symmetry and proportion. Everything is balanced. If you were to draw a line down the middle of a Renaissance facade, the left side would be a near-perfect mirror image of the right. Windows are placed in neat, repeating patterns. Columns are spaced with mathematical precision. This isn't random. Architects like Leon Battista Alberti wrote entire books on the subject, arguing that beauty was rooted in this kind of logical, harmonious order. They drew heavily from the classical orders, the Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian columns, first developed by the ancient Greeks. You'll see these everywhere, not just holding things up, but also as decorative elements that divide and organize a building's facade, giving it a sense of rhythm and clarity. Take a look at the Palazzo Rucellai in Florence, designed by Alberti. He used different classical orders on each level, creating a facade that is both learned and elegant, a perfect expression of the owner's wealth and classical education. Another key element is the geometry. Renaissance architects were obsessed with simple, pure geometric forms, the square and the circle. To them, these shapes were divine, representing perfection and eternity. The floor plans of churches and villas were often based on a square grid with chapels and rooms arranged symmetrically around a central point. The circle found its ultimate expression in the central plan church, a design where All parts of the building are equidistant from a central point, often capped by a perfect hemispherical dome. This design was believed to be the ideal representation of God's perfection. Let's talk about some of the signature elements you can look for to spot a Renaissance building. Besides the columns and symmetrical facades, look for rounded arches instead of the pointed arches of the Gothic period. Look for coffered ceilings, those sunken square panels that often decorate the inside of domes and vaults. Just like in the ancient Pantheon, notice the use of the piano nobile, or noble floor. In Renaissance palaces, the main floor for entertaining and living was on the second level, which had higher ceilings and larger, more ornate windows than the ground floor or upper stories. The materials themselves also tell a story. While Gothic architecture often feels like a single massive sculpture of stone, Renaissance architects loved to contrast different materials. You might see the clean, white lines of marble columns set against the soft gray of Petra Serena sandstone, or the rough texture of rusticated stone on the ground floor giving way to smooth ashlar masonry above. This contrast helps to articulate the building structure and add visual interest. As the Renaissance matured, it moved from Florence to Rome, where architects like Donato Bramante dreamed of rebuilding the city in the grand classical style. His Tempietto, a small commemorative tomb in the courtyard of San Pietro in Montorio, is considered a perfect gem of high Renaissance architecture. Despite its tiny size, it embodies all the key principles: a central plan, a perfect dome, and the rigorous use of the classical Doric order. It's like a textbook example brought to life. And then, of course, there is Michelangelo. Though he considered himself a sculptor first, his architectural work pushed the boundaries of the high Renaissance. He took the classical rules and began to bend them, introducing a sense of drama, tension, and personal expression that would pave the way for the later Baroque style. His work on St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, particularly the design of his magnificent dome, was a monumental feat that built upon Brunelleschi's earlier innovations, creating a structure that would become the very heart of the Catholic world. Later Renaissance architects like Andrea Palladio took these ideas and spread them far beyond Italy. Palladio's villas in the Venetian countryside are famous for their perfect symmetry and integration with the landscape. He published his designs in a book called The Four Books of Architecture, which became one of the most influential architectural treatises ever written. His work was so widely copied that it created its own style Palladianism, which became incredibly popular in Britain and later in the United States. If you've ever seen the White House in Washington, D.C., you're looking at a building deeply influenced by the legacy of Andrea Palladio. So, from Brunelleschi's dome to Palladio's villas, Renaissance architecture was more than just a style. It was a physical manifestation of a new way of thinking. It was rational, it was mathematical, it was human-centered, and it was deeply in love with the classical past. It created buildings that were not only beautiful and harmonious, but also communicated powerful ideas about order, intellect, and humanity's place in the universe. The principles it established were so powerful that they continued to influence architects for centuries, shaping the look of our cities in ways we can still see all around us today. Have you ever looked at a building and just felt a sense of perfect harmony? Like every single part of it was exactly where it was supposed to be. Chances are, you were looking at a building inspired by the Renaissance. This incredible period, stretching from the 14th to the 17th century, wasn't just about famous paintings and sculptures. It was a revolution in architecture, a rebirth of classical ideas that completely reshaped the world. So, grab your virtual compass and because today we're going on a journey to uncover the secrets of Renaissance architecture, focusing on the three magic ingredients: symmetry, proportion, and geometry. Before the Renaissance, Europe was dominated by the Gothic style. Think soaring, pointed arches, intricate details, and a feeling of reaching up towards the heavens, like in the famous Notre Dame Cathedral. It was dramatic and awe-inspiring, but it was also complex and sometimes a little chaotic. When the Renaissance dawned, primarily in Florence, Italy, thinkers and artists began looking back, way back, to the classical worlds of ancient Greece and Rome. They rediscovered the writings of architects like who believed that architecture should imitate nature and that the universe was governed by mathematical harmony. This was a game. Instead of reaching for the heavens in a complex way, Renaissance architects aimed to create a sense of earthly perfection and rational order. They wanted their buildings to be clear, logical, and beautiful to the human eye, reflecting a newfound confidence in human potential. This shift in thinking is the key to understanding everything that came next. The most obvious and powerful tool they used was symmetry. Imagine drawing a line straight down the middle of a building. In Renaissance architecture, the left side is almost always a perfect mirror image of the right side. This isn't just a design quirk. It was a philosophical statement. It created a sense of balance, stability, and predictability that was deeply pleasing to the human mind. Take a look at the Palazzo Farnese in Rome. You can see how the windows, columns, and decorative elements on one side are perfectly mirrored on the other. This isn't just about the facade either. The entire floor plan, the layout of the rooms, was often arranged symmetrically around a central axis, creating a clear and orderly flow through the space. This pursuit of balance was a direct rejection of the more organic and sometimes irregular layouts of medieval castles. It represented a world governed by reason and order, not by chancy. Now, let's talk about proportion. This is where things get really fascinating. Renaissance architects were obsessed with finding the perfect relationships between the different parts of a building. It wasn't enough for a building to be symmetrical. The height of a column had to relate perfectly to its width. The size of a window had to be in a perfect ratio to the size of the wall, and the dimensions of a room had to relate to the dimensions of the entire building. They believed that certain mathematical ratios, found in nature and in music, were inherently beautiful. The most famous of these is the golden ratio, but they also used simple whole number ratios like 1 to 2 or 2, 3. A great example of this is the Pazzi Chapel in Florence, designed by the legendary Filippo Brunelleschi. Every element, from the height of the pilasters to the width of the base, is governed by a simple, repeating, proportional system. Walking into a space like that feels incredibly serene because your brain subconsciously recognizes the underlying mathematical harmony. It's like listening to a beautiful piece of music, but for your eyes. Of course, you can't have symmetry and proportion without geometry. For Renaissance architects, geometry wasn't just a tool for drawing plans. It was the divine language of the universe. Simple geometric shapes were seen as the purest forms and were used everywhere. The square and the circle were considered the most perfect of all. The square represented the earthly, the stable, and the rational, while the circle represented the heavenly, the infinite, and the divine. The ultimate goal for many architects was to perfectly combine the two, symbolizing the connection between man and God. You see this everywhere. Floor plans were often based on a square grid, domes. Like Brunelleschi's magnificent dome for the Florence Cathedral, were based on the perfect geometry of the circle. Facades were often divided into a grid of squares and rectangles. Look at Leon Battista Alberti's facade for Santa Maria Novella. He used a system of squares to organize the entire design, creating a facade that is both visually stunning and intellectually rigorous. This use of pure geometry gave Renaissance buildings their characteristic clarity and sense of timeless order. So, who were the rock stars of this architectural movement? We've already mentioned a few. Filippo Brunelleschi is often called the founding father of Renaissance architecture. His work on the Florence Cathedral dome was an engineering marvel that had in it been seen since ancient Rome, and it truly kicked off the entire era. Then there was Leon Battista Alberti, who was more than just an architect. He was a true Renaissance man, a writer, a theorist, and an artist. His book on the art of building laid out the principles of proportion and harmony for generations of architects to follow. And we can't forget architects like Donato Bramante, who designed the initial plan for St. Peter's Basilica in Rome based on a perfectly symmetrical Greek cross plan, or Andrea Palladio, whose villas in the Venetian countryside became so influential that they spawned an entire style known as Palladianism, which spread all over Europe and even to America. Think of the White House in Washington, D.C. Its classical columns and symmetrical design are a direct descendant of Palladio's work. The legacy of Renaissance architecture is quite simply everywhere. Its principles of symmetry, proportion, and geometry became the fundamental grammar of Western architecture for the next 500 years. The Baroque, Neoclassical, and many other styles that followed were all in some way a reaction to or a development of Renaissance ideas. The core belief that a building should be rational, harmonious, and human-skilled has never really gone away, even today. In our world of glass and steel skyscrapers, you can still see the influence of the Renaissance in the quest for balance and elegant proportions. It taught us that a building is more than just a shelter. It can be an expression of order, a celebration of human intellect, and a source of profound, calming beauty. So, the next time you're walking through a city and you see a building with a grand symmetrical facade or a perfectly circular dome, take a moment to appreciate it. You're not just looking at stone and mortar, you're looking at a 500-year-old idea brought to life. You're seeing the enduring power of symmetry, the quiet music of proportion, and the divine language of geometry. It's the legacy of the Renaissance, a testament to a time when humanity looked to the past to build a more perfect future. Influence of Roman and Greek architecture, the towering domes, the elegant columns, the perfect sense of harmony and balance. There's a good chance you were looking at a masterpiece of Renaissance architecture. But have you ever wondered where those brilliant ideas came from? It wasn't just a sudden burst of creativity. Tonight, we're going on a fascinating journey back in time, even further back than the Renaissance itself, to uncover the ancient secrets that sparked one of the most incredible artistic movements in human history. We're talking about the giants on whose shoulders the Renaissance masters stood, the architects of ancient Rome and Greece. So, grab a coffee, get comfortable, and let's unravel how the classical world was reborn. The story of the Renaissance, which spanned roughly from the 14th to the 17th century, is really a story of rediscovery. The term Renaissance literally means rebirth, and what was being reborn was a profound interest in the art, philosophy, and science of classical antiquity. For centuries, during the Middle Ages, much of this ancient knowledge was lost or forgotten in Western Europe. The prevailing architectural style was Gothic, with its pointed arches, ribbed vaults, and flying buttresses, all designed to reach ever higher towards the heavens. It was magnificent, but it was a completely different language of design. Then something began to shift. Scholars, artists, and architects started unearthing ancient texts and, more importantly, looking at the physical ruins scattered across Italy. They saw the remnants of the Roman Forum, the majestic Pantheon, and the Colosseum, and they were utterly captivated. They saw a world built on principles of logic, order, and human-centered design that felt revolutionary. This wasn't just about copying old buildings. It was about reviving a whole worldview. So, what exactly did they borrow? Let's start with the most visible elements. Think of the Parthenon in Athens, or any Roman temple. What do you see? Columns. Lots of them. The Greeks developed three main orders, or styles of columns. The simple and sturdy, the more elegant, Ionic with its scroll-like tops, and the highly decorative Corinthian, crowned with acanthus leaves. The Romans adopted these and added their own variations, like the Tuscan and composite orders. When Renaissance architects like Filippo Brunelleschi and Leon Battista Alberti studied these, they saw more than just support structures. They saw a mathematical system of proportion and beauty. They brought these classical orders back in a huge way. Suddenly, the facades of churches, palaces, and public buildings were adorned with perfectly proportioned columns and pilastors, those flattened columns you see embedded in a wall. This brought a sense of rhythm, order, and classical grandeur that had been absent for 1,000 years. Another huge influence was the arch and the dome. The Romans were absolute masters of the rounded arch. They used it to build everything from massive aqueducts that carried water for miles to triumphal arches celebrating military victories. This was a stark contrast to the pointed arches of the Gothic style. The Renaissance masters embraced the simple, perfect geometry of the Roman rounded arch. You see it everywhere in their designs, framing doorways and windows, creating elegant arcades and lodges. And then there's the dome. The absolute pinnacle of Roman engineering was the Pantheon in Rome, with its breathtaking, unreinforced concrete dome and the famous oculus opening to the sky. For centuries, the knowledge of how to build something so massive was lost. When it came time to build the dome for the Florence Cathedral, Filippo Brunelleschi spent years studying the Pantheon. He didn't just copy it, he innovated, using a double shell construction and a new herringbone brick pattern to create what is still the largest masonry dome in the world. He revived a classical form but pushed it forward with new Renaissance ingenuity. But the influence went much deeper than just borrowing specific elements like columns and domes. The most profound idea the Renaissance took from the classical world was the concept of harmony and proportion. Greek and Roman architects, influenced by philosophers and mathematicians like Pythagoras and Euclid, believed that beauty was rooted in mathematical precision. They believed that the universe was governed by a divine, harmonious order, and that a building could be a small-scale reflection of this cosmic harmony. They used specific proportions, often derived from the human body, to determine the relationship between the different parts of a building, the height of a column relative to its width, the size of a door relative to the facade. This created a sense of visual balance and serenity. Architects like Alberti and later Andrea Palladio wrote influential treatises based on the ancient Roman rite of Vitruvius, codifying these rules of proportion for a new generation. When you look at a Palladian villa, for example, every single element feels like it's in exactly the right place. That feeling of brightness is a direct result of these ancient mathematical principles. It's a design philosophy that appeals to our innate sense of order. Let's also talk about the shift in focus. Medieval Gothic architecture was all about overwhelming the individual, drawing the eye upward to God, and emphasizing the divine and the otherworldly. Classical architecture, and by extension Renaissance architecture, was much more human-centric. The Greeks and Romans built for people. Their temples, theaters, and basilicas were designed on a human scale. This idea, tied to the philosophical movement of humanism, was central to the Renaissance. Buildings were once again designed to be comfortable, logical, and pleasing to the people who used them. Courtyards in palaces, known as cortiles, were often surrounded by classical arcades, creating beautiful and functional spaces for social interaction. The design wasn't just about glorifying God. It was also about celebrating human potential, intellect, and creativity. This represents a fundamental shift in how people saw their place in the world, and it's carved in the very stone of Renaissance buildings. To see this all come together, just look at St. Peter's Basilica in the Vatican. Its development spanned the High Renaissance, with contributions from masters like Bramante, Raphael, and Michelangelo. You can see the synthesis of classical ideas everywhere. Bramante's original plan was based on a Greek cross, a design with 4 equal arms, celebrating the geometric perfection loved by the ancients. Michelangelo, when he took over, designed its colossal dome, a direct and awe-inspiring homage to Brunelleschi's dome in Florence and the Pantheon in Rome. The massive facade, later designed by Carlo Maderno, is dominated by a giant order of Corinthian columns and pillars, giving it that unmistakable sense of Roman grandeur and authority. The entire building is a masterclass in the application of classical principles of symmetry, proportion, and monumental scale, all reimagined through the lens of Renaissance genius. It's perhaps the ultimate statement of the period's debt to Rome and Greece. So, in the end, the Renaissance wasn't just a simple imitation of the past. It was a dynamic conversation with it. Architects didn't just rebuild Roman temples. They took the vocabulary of classical architecture, the columns, the arches, the domes, the mathematical proportions, and they used it to create something entirely new. They adapted these forms for new types of buildings, like urban palaces and country villas, and for Christian worship. They combined the logic and order of the classical world with their own era's burgeoning creativity, scientific understanding, and artistic ambition. They looked back in order to leap forward, and in doing so, they created a style of architecture so beautiful, so logical, and so fundamentally human that it has continued to influence builders and designers for centuries, right up to the present day. The next time you see a building with classical columns or a stately dome, take a moment to appreciate it. You're not just looking at a building, you're looking at the enduring legacy of a conversation that started over 2,000 years ago, was revived in the Renaissance, and continues to shape the world we live in. Have you ever looked at a building and thought, how on earth did they build that? Well, get ready to have your mind blown. Tonight, we're traveling back in time to Renaissance Florence, a city buzzing with new ideas, artistic genius, and a competitive spirit that would change the world. And at the heart of it all was a challenge that stumped the greatest minds for over a century. How to build a dome over the magnificent Florence Cathedral, Santa Maria del Fiore. For decades, the cathedral stood with a massive, gaping hole in its roof. This octagonal opening was enormous, spanning nearly 150 feet, and it started over 180 feet off the ground. The problem was, no one knew how to cover it. The traditional methods used for Gothic cathedrals, with their flying buttresses and pointed arches, simply wouldn't work. The walls couldn't support the immense weight and outward thrust of a traditional stone dome. The city of Florence had a grand ambition, but no technology to realize it. They even left the hole open to the elements for years, hoping a solution would emerge. It was a monumental, embarrassing problem right in the center of their city. Then, in 1418, the city's leaders held a competition. They invited architects and engineers from all over to submit their ideas. Imagine the scene. Brilliant, ambitious men, all vying for the most prestigious commission of the era. And into this competition walks a man named Filippo Brunelleschi. Wasn't even primarily known as an architect. He was a trained goldsmith and a sculptor. He had a reputation for being brilliant, but also secretive and a bit hot-tempered. Most contestants proposed building a massive and expensive wooden support structure, a scaffolding system called centering, from the ground up to hold the dome's masonry in place as it was being built. But Brunelleschi had a revolutionary, almost insane idea. He proposed building the dome without any internal scaffolding at all. He claimed he could build it to be self-supporting as it rose layer by layer. When the judges asked him to explain his method, he refused, fearing his rivals would steal his ideas. The story goes that he challenged them with a puzzle of his own. He asked if any of them could make an egg stand upright on a flat marble surface. After they all failed, Brunelleschi took the egg, gently cracked its bottom, and stood it on the table. When they protested that they could have done the same, he replied, "Yes, and you would say the same if you knew my plan for the dome." His cleverness and the sheer audacity of his proposal eventually won him the commission, though they did appoint his rival Lorenzo Ghiberti as a co-supervisor, much to Brunelleschi's annoyance. So, how did he do it? This is where the true genius lies. Brunelleschi's solution was not one single trick, but a symphony of innovative technique. First, instead of one solid, heavy dome, he designed two, an inner shell and an outer shell, connected by a network of massive ribs. This doubled shell design made the entire structure lighter and more stable. The inner shell was the main structural support, while the outer shell protected it from the elements and created the grand soaring profile we see today. The space between the two shells even contains a staircase that you can still climb to this day. Next, to solve the problem of the bricks sliding inwards during construction, he laid them in a herringbone pattern called spina di pes. This interlocking pattern transferred the weight of the newly laid bricks onto the more stable, already cured sections of the dome below it. It created a series of self-reinforcing diagonal bands, essentially locking the circular rows of bricks together and preventing them from collapsing inward. This was a technique borrowed from ancient Roman building practices, which Brunelleschi had studied extensively on a trip to Rome. He also had to invent the machinery to get the job done. Remember, this dome was being built hundreds of feet in the air. How do you get thousands of tons of sandstone, marble, and brick up there? Brunelleschi designed a revolutionary 3-speed hoist powered by a single yoke of oxen. What was amazing was that it used a special reversing gear, allowing the oxen to walk in the same direction, whether the hoist was lifting a load or lowering the empty buckets. This saved an incredible amount of time and energy. He also designed a special crane called da castello, which could be moved horizontally around the top of the dome, allowing workers to place materials with pinpoint accuracy. These inventions were so far ahead of their time, they were practically science fiction for the 15th century. The construction began in 1420 and took 16 years. It was a citywide effort, a source of immense civic pride. Imagine the sounds echoing through Florence, the clang of hammers, the shouts of workmen, the creak of Brunelleschi's incredible machines lifting heavy stones high into the sky. It must have been a daily spectacle. Brunelleschi was a hands-on supervisor, overseeing every detail, from the mixing of the mortar to the quality of the bricks. He even set up a canteen with food and watered-down wine on the dome itself to save workers the long trip down and up for their lunch break. A brilliant move for productivity. Finally, in 1436, the main structure of the dome was complete. The final stone was laid, and the cathedral was consecrated in a grand ceremony attended by the Pope. The gaping hole that had shamed Florence for generations was now crowned with the largest and most magnificent dome the world had ever seen. It was a triumph, not just of engineering, but of human ingenuity, persistence, and vision. It signaled the dawn of a new era, proving that humanity could surpass the achievements of the ancients. The dome, or il Duomo, became the symbol of Florence and a beacon of the Renaissance. Brunelleschi's dome wasn't just a roof. It was a declaration. It declared that Florence was the center of a new world of art, science, and human potential. It literally and figuratively lifted the city's aspirations, inspiring a generation of artists and thinkers like Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo, who would later study the dome before designing the dome for St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. Today, when you stand in Florence and look up at that beautiful terracotta-tiled cupola against the Tuscan sky, you're not just seeing a building, you're seeing the result of one man's refusal to accept the impossible. You're seeing a monument to creativity, a testament to the power of a single brilliant idea to change the skyline and the course of history forever. It's a reminder that sometimes the most groundbreaking solutions come from daring to think differently. Renaissance, temples, and churches. Tonight, we're stepping into a world of rebirth, innovation, and breathtaking beauty as we explore the magnificent temples and churches of the Renaissance. This was an era spanning from the 14th to the 17th century, where humanity looked back to the classical past of Greece and Rome to forge a brilliant new future. And nowhere is this more evident than in the sacred spaces they built. So, what makes a Renaissance church so different from, say, the Gothic cathedrals that came before? Well, Gothic architecture was all about soaring heights, pointed arches, and reaching for the heavens. It was dramatic and owing to the Renaissance, however, brought a new sense of order, harmony, and human-centered design. Think of it as a shift from divine mystery to human intellect and potential. Architects were no longer just builders. They were artists and scholars, rediscovering the principles of classical masters. Like Vitruvius, it all started in Florence, Italy, the cradle of the Renaissance. And you can't talk about Renaissance architecture without talking about one man, Filippo. His masterpiece, the dome of the Florence Cathedral, or the Duomo, is the perfect symbol of this transition. For over a century, the cathedral sat with a giant hole in its roof because no one knew how to build a dome that fast. It was an engineering puzzle that baffled the greatest minds of the time. Then came Brunelleschi. He studied ancient Roman structures, like the Pantheon, and came up with a revolutionary double-shelled design. It was a marvel of engineering, built without the traditional wooden scaffolding that everyone thought was necessary. When it was completed in 1436, it wasn't just a roof, it was a powerful statement. It declared that human ingenuity, guided by reason and a study of the past, could achieve the impossible. The dome dominates the Florentine skyline to this day, a testament to this new era of confidence. From Florence, these new ideas spread like wildfire. Architects like Leon Battista Alberti literally wrote the book on Renaissance design, emphasizing proportion, symmetry, and geometric purity. He argued that a church should reflect the perfection of God through the harmony of its design. You can see his principles in action at the Tempio Malatestiano in Roma, where he transformed a Gothic church by wrapping it in a new classical-style marble shell, complete with triumphal arches and elegant pillars. As we move into the High Renaissance, the action shifts from Florence to Rome. Here, the popes became the greatest patrons of the arts, seeking to restore Rome to its former glory. This is the era of giants like Donato Bramante. His Tempieto, or Little Temple, built in the courtyard of San Pietro in Montorio, is considered a perfect example of high Renaissance architecture. Even though it is a tiny building, it packs a huge punch. It's a centrally planned structure, perfectly circular, surrounded by a colonnade of Doric columns and topped with a graceful dome. It was built on the spot traditionally believed to be the site of St. Peter's crucifixion. Bramante used the language of ancient Roman temples to create a Christian monument, perfectly blending classical form with Christian meaning. It's so harmonious, so perfectly proportioned, that it feels like a piece of sculpture as much as a building. It embodies the Renaissance ideal of creating a heaven on earth through rational, beautiful design. And of course, we must talk about the grandest project of them all. The new St. Peter's Basilica in Vatican City. The old basilica was 1,000 years old and falling apart. Pope Julius II envisioned a replacement that would be the most magnificent church in the world. The project would span over a century and involve the greatest artists of the age. Bramante was the first chief architect, proposing a colossal Greek cross plan with a massive central dome. After his death, the project passed through several hands, including Raphael's. But it was Michelangelo who truly left his mark. Taking over in his 70s, he returned to Bramante's original vision, but simplified and strengthened it. His design for the dome is iconic. It's not a perfect hemisphere like the Pantheon. It's slightly taller, more ovoid, giving it a sense of dynamic lift and power. Though he didn't live to see it completed, the Dome of St. Peter's remains his final architectural triumph, a fusion of colossal engineering and divine artistry that defines the skyline of Rome. Inside these churches, the spirit of the Renaissance continued. The interiors were often bright and open, a stark contrast to the darker Gothic naves. Geometric patterns, coffered ceilings, and classical motifs like columns and round arches created a sense of rational, ordered space. Every element was designed in relation to the others, creating a unified and harmonious whole. The goal was to inspire awe not through overwhelming scale alone, but through the intellectual and spiritual clarity of the design. As the Renaissance evolved, we see the emergence of Mannerism and the transition to the Baroque period. Architects like Andrea Palladio took the classical language and began to use it in new, more complex ways. His churches in Venice, like San Giorgio Maggiore, are famous for their ingenious facades. He cleverly layered two classical temple fronts on top of each other to solve the problem of fitting a classical design onto a traditional church building with a tall central nave and lower side aisles. It's a brilliant, almost theatrical solution. Palladia's influence was immense. He published the 4 books on architecture, which spread his ideas across Europe and even to America. Thomas Jefferson, for example, was a huge admirer of Palladio. So, the principles developed in these 16th century Italian churches had a lasting impact on architectural design for centuries to come. In essence, the temples and churches of the Renaissance tell a story of profound cultural change. They are monuments to a new way of thinking, where faith and reason, art and science were seen not as opposites, but as two sides of the same coin. They embodied the period's optimism and its belief in the power of humanity to understand the world and create things of sublime beauty. From Brunelleschi's Dome to Michelangelo's St. Peter's, these buildings aren't just stone and marble. They are the dreams of an entire era made tangible, inspiring wonder and contemplation even today. Have you ever strolled through a European city and felt like you've stepped back in time? The grand plazas, the symmetrical streets, the magnificent domes. Much of what we admire in cities like Florence, Rome, and Paris has its roots in one of the most transformative periods in history. The Renaissance. This wasn't just an age of artistic masterpieces and scientific breakthroughs. It was an era that completely reimagined what a city could be. Before the Renaissance, medieval cities were often a maze of narrow, winding streets. They were built for defense, with high walls and cramped quarters. Function over form was the rule. But as the 14th century dawned, a new way of thinking began to take hold in Italy. Scholars and artists rediscovered the classical ideals of ancient Greece and Rome, and with them came a renewed focus on order, proportion, and human experience. They started asking, what if a city could be more than just a fortress? What if it could be a work of art in itself? This shift in mindset was revolutionary. The focus moved from a God-centered, otherworldly perspective to a human-centered one. This is humanism, and it was the driving force behind the Renaissance. Thinkers believed that humans were capable of great things, and that our environment should reflect that potential. A city, therefore, should be orderly, beautiful, and designed to foster a sense of civic pride and community. The chaotic, organic layout of the medieval town was seen as illogical and outdated. The ideal Renaissance city was to be a place of harmony, logic, and Buidia, paradise on earth created by human hands. So, how did they do it? The first major innovation was the concept of the ideal city. Architects and theorists like Leon Battista, Alberti, and Filarete didn't just design buildings. They designed entire urban systems on paper. Their drawings show cities laid out in perfect geometric shapes, often circles or stars, with radial streets leading to a central square. This wasn't just about looking good. It was about creating a rational, efficient, and controllable urban space. At the heart of this ideal was the straight street. Unlike the meandering paths of medieval towns, the straight street offered a clear line of sight, creating powerful vistas that terminated in a significant building like a church or a palace. This created a sense of theatricality and grandeur, guiding the eye and the body through the city in a deliberate way. The public square, or piazza, was also reborn. In medieval times, squares were often irregular spaces left over between buildings. The Renaissance transformed them into meticulously planned, symmetrical, open areas. They became the civic heart of the city, framed by elegant buildings with uniform facades. Techi di Piazza del Compadalia in Rome, designed by none other than Michelangelo. He didn't just plop down a statue. He designed the entire space, from the stunning geometric pavement to the redesigned palace facade, creating a unified and breathtaking public stage. These piazzas were designed for people to gather, to conduct business, and to celebrate. They were the living rooms of the city. Of course, these grand ideas had to be applied to existing cities, which was no easy task. Rome is a perfect example. During the Renaissance, popes like Sixtus V launched massive urban renewal projects. Their goal was to connect the major Christian basilicas with a network of long, straight roads. This wasn't just for religious pilgrims. These new avenues cut right through the old medieval fabric, creating a new sense of order and making the city easier to navigate and control. They used obelisks, ancient Egyptian monuments brought to Rome, as giant signposts at the end of these vistas, effectively branding the city with a powerful mix of ancient glory and Christian triumph. It was a masterclass in using urban design to project power and ideology. Another key element was the facade. For the first time, the exterior of a building became just as important as the interior. Renaissance architects used classical elements like columns, pediments, and arches to create orderly, rhythmic facades. Alberti, in his work on the Palazzo Rucellai in Florence, applied a grid of classical orders to the front of a private home, bringing a sense of public dignity and harmony to a residential street. This idea of a building-esque public face contributing to the beauty of the entire street was a fundamental Renaissance innovation that we still see in urban planning today. And we can't forget the fortifications. While the ideal city was about peace and harmony, the reality of the 16th century was one of constant warfare, especially with the advent of cannon fire. This led to the development of the Star Fort. Engineers designed fortresses with pointed bastions or triangular projections, creating a star shape. This geometric design eliminated blind spots and allowed defenders to cover the walls with crossfire. The Italian city of Palma Nova, founded in 1593, is a stunning real-world example of this. It was built from scratch as a perfect nine-pointed star, combining the military necessity of defense with the Renaissance ideal of geometric perfection. It's a city that is both a fortress and a philosophical statement. So, what is the legacy of Renaissance urban design? It's everywhere. The idea that a city should be planned with grand avenues, public squares, and beautiful vistas comes directly from this period. When you see the Champs-Élysées in Paris leading to the Arc de Triomphe or the National Mall in Washington, D.C., you're seeing the legacy of the Renaissance Straight Street and its powerful terminating axis. The emphasis on symmetry, order, and creating spaces that inspire awe and civic pride is a direct inheritance from the humanists and architects who dared to dream of the ideal city. They taught us that a city is not just a collection of buildings, but a cohesive environment that can shape our lives, lift our spirits, and express our highest aspirations. The Renaissance found cities of stone and left them as works of art. Renaissance architecture in France and England. Tonight, we're embarking on a fascinating journey through time, back to an era of rebirth and artistic revolution. Renaissance. While Italy is often hailed as the cradle of the Renaissance, its powerful influence spread far and wide, transforming the cultural landscapes of France and England in truly unique ways. So, grab a cup of tea, get comfortable, and let's explore the magnificent world of Renaissance architecture in these two great nations. The story begins in the late 15th century as the Italian Renaissance, with its emphasis on symmetry, proportion, and classical geometry, began to capture the imagination of European monarchs. French kings, returning from military campaigns in Italy, were captivated by the elegant palaces and villas they saw. They didn't just bring back stories. They brought back Italian artists and architects, like Leonardo da Vinci, to their courts. This marked the beginning of the French Renaissance style. However, the French didn't simply copy Italian designs. Instead, they skillfully blended the new classical ideas with their own rich, flamboyant Gothic traditions. This fusion created something entirely new and spectacular. Think of it as a beautiful architectural conversation between two distinct cultures. A perfect example of this early French Renaissance is the Château de Chambord in the Loire Valley. Commissioned by King Francis I, it's a masterpiece from a distance. Its skyline looks like a fairy tale Gothic castle with its complex roofline of towers, turrets, and chimneys. It's got that dramatic vertical feel we associate with medieval fortresses. But as you get closer, you start to see the Italian influence. The layout is more symmetrical. The windows are large and regularly spaced, and classical details like pilasters and decorative medallions adorn the facades. The most breathtaking feature is the famous double helix staircase, a marvel of engineering and design, possibly influenced by Leonardo da Vinci himself. It's this incredible mix of old and new that makes French Renaissance chateaux so enchanting. Another gem is the Château de Fontainebleau, a royal residence that was expanded and redecorated by a succession of French monarchs. Here, Italian artists like Rosso Fiorentino and Primatecchio established the school of Fontainebleau. They created lavish interiors filled with intricate stucco work, elaborate frescoes, and decorative woodwork. The Gallery of Francis I is a stunning example where classical motifs are combined with a uniquely French elegance and extravagance, creating an atmosphere of pure opulence. So, in France, the Renaissance wasn't a complete break from the past, but a brilliant event. They took the harmony and order of Italian classicism and dressed it in their own flamboyant, Gothic-inspired finery. It was a style perfectly suited to the glamorous and powerful French court. Now, let's cross the English Channel. The Renaissance arrived in England a bit later, around the early 16th century during the Tudor period. Like the French, the English were slow to completely abandon their own strong architectural traditions, particularly the Perpendicular Gothic style. The result was a distinctive English Renaissance, often divided into the Tudor, Elizabethan, and Jacobean periods. Tudor architecture retained many medieval features. Think of Hampton Court Palace. While it features some symmetrical elements and terracotta roundels inspired by Italian arts, its overall character is still very much English. With its red brickwork, towering gatehouses, and decorative, twisted chimneys, it's grand and imposing, but in a sturdy, grounded way that feels very different from the elegant French chateau. The real flourishing of Renaissance ideas happened under Queen Elizabeth I. This was the age of the great prodigy houses. These were massive, extravagant country homes built by wealthy courtiers to impress the Queen, hoping she might visit. Hardwicke Hall in Derbyshire is a prime example. Its famous motto is Hardwicke Hall, more glass than wall. And it's true. The building is famous for its enormous windows, which were a huge luxury at the time. This obsession with glass and light, along with a more symmetrical floor plan, shows a clear move toward Renaissance principles. Yet, it retains a distinct Englishness with its towering height and solid, powerful presence. These houses were less about delicate Italian classicism and more about displaying wealth and power on a grand scale. Moving into the Jacobean era in the early 17th century, the influence of classical architecture became even more pronounced, thanks in large part to one man, Inigo Jones. Jones had traveled extensively in Italy and studied the works of Andrea Palladio, a master of classical proportion. He brought a much more academically correct, pure form of classicism back to England. His work was revolutionary. Take the Queen's House in Greenwich, for example, completed in 1635. It was a complete departure from the busy, decorative style of the Jacobean, with its perfect symmetry, clean lines, and classical loggia. It looks like it could have been plucked directly from the Venetian countryside. It was the first fully classical building in England, and it set the stage for the Palladian style that would dominate British architecture for the next century. So, when we compare the two, we see two very different paths. French Renaissance architecture was a sophisticated fusion, blending Italian elegance with its own Gothic fantasy to serve the glamour of the royal court. English Renaissance architecture, on the other hand, was a slower, more pragmatic. It started with Tudor homes that cautiously adopted new motifs, moved to the ground, and showy prodigy houses of the Elizabethan era, and finally culminated in the pure academic classicism introduced by Inigo Jones. Both nations took the fundamental ideas of the Italian Renaissance symmetry, proportion, and classical orders and adapted them to fit their own climate, materials, and cultural identity. The result is a rich and varied architectural legacy that continues to inspire awe and admiration today. From the fairy tale chateau of the Loire Valley to the stately homes of the English countryside, these buildings are not just stone and mortar. They are enduring symbols of a transformative period in European history. Italian palaces and villas. We'll be exploring the magnificent palaces and villas of Italy, architectural marvels that still captivate us centuries later, from the bustling city centers to the serene countryside. These buildings were more than just homes. They were powerful statements of wealth, intellect, and a new way of looking at the world. So, grab your virtual passport because our architectural tour of Renaissance Italy starts now. The Renaissance, spanning roughly from the 14th to the 17th century, began in Florence. It was a time when wealthy families, like the Medici, became major patrons of the arts. They didn't just fund paintings and sculptures. They commissioned entire buildings to reflect their status and sophisticated tastes. These urban palaces, or palazzi, were designed to impress. Unlike the fortified defensive castles of the Middle Ages, these new structures were open, elegant, and inspired by the classical ideals of ancient Rome and Greece. They were symbols of a new, confident era. Let's take a closer look at a quintessential example, the Palazzo Medici Riccardi in Florence, designed by Michelozzo di Bartolomeo in the mid-15th century. It's a perfect case study in Renaissance palazzo architecture. Look at the facade. It's divided into three distinct levels. The ground floor features rough, heavy stonework known as rustication, giving it a solid, fortress-like appearance that projects power and stability. As your eyes move upward, the stone becomes smoother and more refined on the second and third floors. This progression creates a sense of lightness and elite. The whole design is capped with a massive projecting cornice, a classical feature borrowed directly from ancient Roman temples. Step inside one of these palazzi and you'd find a central courtyard, or cortile. This was the heart of the home, an open-air space surrounded by graceful arcades with columns and arches. This design was also inspired by Roman architecture, particularly the atriums of ancient villas. The courtyard provided light and air to the surrounding rooms and served as a semi-public space for receiving guests and conducting business. It was a beautiful, functional transition between the public street and the private family quarters, all while showcasing the owner's classical education and refined taste. The layout of these palaces was highly organized and hierarchical. The ground floor was typically used for business and storage. The main living area, the piano nobile or noble floor, was on the second level. This floor had the highest ceilings and the most lavish decorations, including frescoes, tapestries, and ornate furniture. It was where the family would entertain important guests and display their art collections. The top floor was usually reserved for their family's private bedrooms and servants' quarters. This clear, logical division of space was a hallmark of Renaissance design, reflecting a new emphasis on order and reason. As the Renaissance progressed, this architectural style spread from Florence to other major Italian cities like Rome and Venice. In Rome, cardinals and popes built grand palaces to assert their power. The Palazzo Farnese, designed in part by Michelangelo, is a monumental example. It's larger and more imposing than its Florentine predecessors, with a sense of grandeur that reflects Rome's status as the center of the Christian world. Its perfectly symmetrical facade and harmonious proportions embody the high Renaissance ideal of perfect, divinely inspired order. But the Renaissance life wasn't confined to the city. As wealthy families sought refuge from the summer heat and the chaos of urban life, they began building luxurious country homes or villas. These were not just rustic farmhouses. They were idyllic retreats designed for leisure, contemplation, and intellectual pursuits. Inspired by the writings of ancient Romans like Pliny the Younger, who described his own countryside estates, Renaissance villas were carefully integrated with their natural surroundings. The landscape wasn't just a backdrop. It was an essential part of the design. One of the greatest masters of the Renaissance villa was Andrea Palladio. Working in the Veneto region near Venice, Palladio perfected a style that would influence architects for centuries to come all the way to the White House in Washington, D.C. His villas, like the famous Villa Capra, also known as La Rotonda, are masterpieces of symmetry and harmony. La Rotonda is completely symmetrical, with 4 identical porticos or porchas with columns facing in each direction. This design allows the inhabitants to enjoy panoramic views of the surrounding countryside from every side. It perfectly merges the structure with its environment. The gardens of these villas were just as important as the houses themselves. They were not wild, natural spaces, but meticulously designed outdoor rooms. Renaissance gardens were often arranged in geometric patterns, with neat hedges, fountains, grottos, and classical sculptures. They were meant for strolling, conversation, and quiet reflection. These gardens represented the humanist idea of humanity imposing order on nature, creating a perfect, harmonious world in miniature. Places like the gardens of the Villa d'Este Tivoli, with their incredible array of fountains and water features, were designed to delight the senses and inspire the intellect. Ultimately, the palaces and villas of the Italian Renaissance were more than just beautiful buildings. They were the physical embodiment of a new philosophy. They celebrated human achievement, reason, and the rediscovery of classical antiquity. From the imposing palazzi of Florence to the serene villas of the Venetian countryside, they tell a story of wealth, power, and an unshakable belief in the potential of humanity. They were stages upon which the drama of the Renaissance unfolded, and their influence on Western architecture is still felt to this day. The role of the architect in Renaissance society. We often think of the stunning paintings and sculptures of this era, but what about the magnificent buildings that housed them? Who were the masterminds behind the domes, palaces, and piazzas that still take our breath away today? We're diving deep into the fascinating evolution of the architect, from a humble craftsman to a celebrated genius. So, picture this. It's the late Middle Ages. If you wanted a building constructed, you'd hire a master mason or a master carpenter. These were highly skilled craftsmen, leaders of their guilds, who learned their trade through years of hands-on apprenticeship. Their knowledge was practical, passed down through generations. They knew how to cut stone, how to raise a wall, and how to build a roof that wouldn't collapse. Their designs were often based on established traditions and templates. They were respected, certainly, but they weren't seen as artists in the way we think of them today. Their social standing was firmly in the world of manual labor, not the lofty realm of intellectual pursuits. Then, everything started to change. The Renaissance, beginning in 14th century Italy, was a rebirth of classical ideas from ancient Greece and Rome. Scholars and artists became obsessed with rediscovering lost knowledge. They unearthed ancient texts like Vitruvius's Architectura, the only surviving major work on architecture from classical antiquity. This book was a game changer. It wasn't just a how-to manual, it was a philosophical treatise. Vitruvius argued that architecture was a science rooted in mathematics, geometry, and proportion. He talked about the famous triad of firmitas, utilitas, venustas, firmness, utility, and beauty. Suddenly, building wasn't just about shelter. It was about creating a harmonious, rational, and beautiful environment that reflected the order of the universe itself. This intellectual shift created a new kind of builder. The architect, the first true Renaissance architect, is widely considered to be Filippo. Trained as a goldsmith and sculptor, Brunelleschi was a brilliant polymath. His most famous achievement, the incredible dome of the Florence Cathedral, was an engineering marvel that had stumped builders for over a century. He didn't just solve it with brute force. He used his knowledge of mathematics, classical building techniques, and inventive new machinery that he designed himself. Brunelleschi's success proved that an architect was more than a craftsman. He was an inventor, an engineer, and a visionary thinker. He commanded immense respect and, importantly, a much higher social status and fee than any master mason before him. Following in Brunelleschi's footsteps was another giant, Leon Battista Alberti. Alberti was the ultimate Renaissance man. He was a writer, a philosopher, a musician, and a legal scholar. For him, architecture was the noblest of the arts. He wrote his own hugely influential book on the art of building, which went even further than Alberti argued that the architect should be a highly educated intellectual, fluent in history, philosophy, and mathematics. He believed the architect's primary job was the design. The intellectual creation, the actual construction, could be overseen by others. This separation of design from construction was a radical idea. It elevated the architect from the dusty building site to the refined world of patrons and scholars. The architect was no longer just building a structure. He was realizing a perfect, divinely inspired idea on earth. With this new status came new opportunities. Renaissance architects weren't just hired fans. They became trusted advisors to the most powerful people in Europe, popes, princes, and wealthy merchant families like the Medici. They didn't just design buildings. They designed entire cities. They thought about how streets would connect, where public squares should be, and how buildings would relate to each other to create a beautiful and functional urban experience. Think of Michelangelo, who was not only a painter and sculptor, but also the chief architect of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. His involvement wasn't just about the structure. It was about creating a powerful symbol of the church's authority and glory. These architects weren't just serving their patrons, they were shaping the very image and identity of their society. The tools of the trade changed as well. While medieval masons relied on full-scale templates and physical models, Renaissance architects embraced new techniques for representing their ideas. They mastered the art of perspective drawing, allowing them to create realistic, three-dimensional depictions of their designs on paper. This allowed patrons to see and approve a design with much greater clarity before a single stone was laid. The architectural drawing became a work of art. in itself a testament to the architect's skill and intellect. This ability to communicate a complex vision on paper further solidified their position as thinkers and designers, distinct from the builders who executed the plan. So, what's the ultimate legacy of the Renaissance architect? It's the very idea of what an architect is today. The shift from a guild craftsman to a university-educated professional began right here. The idea that architecture is a blend of art and science, a profession requiring deep intellectual and creative thought, was born in this period. The architect became a celebrated public figure, a star-architect in their own time, whose personal vision could shape the world around them. Brunelleschi, Alberti, Bramante, Michelangelo. These figures laid the foundation for the profession as we know it. They proved that a building could be more than just stone and mortar. It could be a poem, a mathematical equation, and a philosophical statement all at once. The next time you admire a grand dome or a perfectly proportioned facade from this period, remember the incredible transformation that took place. It wasn't just about new styles. It was about a whole new identity for the people who dreamed them up. The rise of the architect is one of the great and sometimes overlooked stories of the Renaissance. It's a testament to the power of ideas to elevate a craft into an art and a builder into a visionary. Interior decoration in Renaissance buildings, that feeling of awe, the sheer scale, the intricate details, much of what we consider classical and luxurious today has its roots in one of the most transformative periods in history, the Renaissance. Tonight, we're not just looking at the famous paintings or sculptures. We're going inside, pulling back the velvet curtains to explore the stunning world of Renaissance interior decoration. From the 14th to the 17th century, a revolution in art and thought swept across Europe, and it didn't stop at the front door. So, let's unlock the secrets of how the great minds of the Renaissance lived. The Renaissance, which literally means rebirth, was a rediscovery of the classical ideals of ancient Greece and Rome. After the medieval period, there was a new focus on humanism, logic, and beauty. This wasn't just an abstract idea. You could see it, touch it, and live within it. Architects and designers moved away from the dark, imposing castles of the Middle Ages and started creating spaces that were all about light, harmony, and human-scale proportion. They wanted to build a heaven on earth, a space that was both inspiring and comfortable, reflecting the newfound confidence and wealth of its owners. Imagine the shift from dimly lit stone fortresses to bright, airy villas filled with art. This was more than just redecorating. It was a complete rethinking of what a home could be. It was about creating an environment that nourished the mind and soul, a stage for the dramas of life, business, and art. So, what were the key ingredients of a Renaissance interior? Let's start with the foundation. The walls. Forget plain, painted drywall. In the Renaissance, walls were a canvas for opulence. One of the most popular treatments was the fresco. This is a technique where pigments are applied to wet plaster, so the painting literally becomes part of the wall. Think of the Sistine Chapel. Ceiling that's a fresco, but on a domestic scale, wealthy patrons would commission elaborate scenes from mythology, history, or religion to cover their rooms. These weren't just pretty pictures. They were status symbols and conversation starters, showcasing the owner's education and taste. If frescoes were too expensive, another option was wood paneling. Rich, dark woods like walnut or oak were carved with intricate patterns, a style known as wainscoting, which often covered the lower half of the wall, adding warmth and texture. And for the ultimate display of wealth, tapestries. These weren't your grandma's needlepoint. We're talking massive, hand-woven textile artworks that could cover an entire wall. They were incredibly expensive, often costing more than the house itself. Tapestries served multiple purposes. They provided insulation against cold stone walls. They dampened sound, and most importantly, they told stories. Epic battles, biblical scenes, or lush landscapes were woven with silk and even gold and silver threads. Because they were portable, a wealthy family could take their tapestries with them when they moved between their city palaces and country villas, instantly transforming any space into a familiar and luxurious home. They were the original mobile status symbols, a clear declaration of power and prestige. Now, let's look down. The floors in Renaissance homes were just as impressive as the walls. In grand public rooms, you'd find stunning floors made of marble, travertine, or terracotta tiles. These were often laid in complex geometric patterns, like checkerboards or intricate mosaics. The designs were inspired by ancient Roman examples and were all about order, symmetry, and mathematical precision key principles of Renaissance design. The patterns weren't random. They were carefully planned to lead the eye, define spaces, and create a sense of harmony and balance. In more private, domestic areas, you might find wide wooden planks, polished to a high sheen, and sometimes covered with precious, hand-woven oriental rugs. These rugs, imported from the East, were so valuable that they were often displayed on tables, not just on the floor. And what about looking up? Ceilings were never an afterthought. They were a fifth wall designed to draw the eye upward and inspire awe. The coffered ceiling was a hallmark of the era. This design features a series of recessed panels, usually in a square or octagonal grid. Each coffer could be carved, gilded, or even painted with a small rosette or emblem. This created an incredible sense of depth and grandeur, making the room feel taller and more expansive. Another popular style was the beamed ceiling, where massive exposed wooden beams provided structural support but were also celebrated as a design element. These beams were often carved and painted with elaborate patterns, adding a rustic yet sophisticated charm. In both cases, the ceiling was an integral part of the room's overall architectural statement. Now, let's furnish the room. Renaissance furniture was solid, substantial, and built to last for generations, unlike the flimsy, mass-produced items we often see today. Each piece was a work of craftsmanship. A key item in any wealthy household was the cassone, or marriage chest. This was a large, ornate chest, often beautifully painted or carved, given to a bride to hold her dowry. They were practical storage, but also works of art, depicting scenes of love and marriage. Tables were massive. Trestle-style affairs designed to accommodate large family gatherings and banquets. Chairs were becoming more common, replacing the simple benches of the medieval era. You'd find stately, high-backed chairs with carved details and leather or velvet upholstery for the head of the household, while others might sit on simpler, yet still elegant, scabolo chairs. The furniture was heavy, architectural, and meant to command a presence in the room. And, of course, we can't talk about the Renaissance without talking about art and accessories. This was the age of the patron, where wealthy families like the Medici in Florence would commission paintings and sculptures from the greatest artists of the day, Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo. Having a collection of art wasn't just about decoration. It was about showing off your culture, intellect, and connection to the great artistic movements of the time. Portraits of family members lined the walls, reinforcing lineage and power. Sculptures, often inspired by classical antiquity, would be displayed in niches or on pedestals. Even smaller objects, like pottery, glassware from Venice and metalwork were chosen with incredible care. Every object in the room contributed to a carefully curated story about the family who lived there. One of the most important concepts tying all of this together was symmetry. If you were to draw a line down the center of a Renaissance room, the left side would be a near-perfect mirror image of the right. A fireplace would be centered on a wall, flanked by two identical windows or two matching chairs. This love of balance and order was a direct reaction against the more chaotic and organic feel of the Gothic style that came before it. It reflected the era's belief in a rational, ordered universe. This principle of symmetry created spaces that felt calm, stable, and eternally graceful. It is a design principle that is still incredibly powerful and widely used by designers today to create a sense of harmony and peace in a room. So, how can you bring a touch of the Renaissance into your own home without needing a Medici-sized budget? You can start small. Think about creating symmetry. Try placing two identical lamps on either side of your sofa or centering a piece of art above your bed. Introduce rich textures and materials. A velvet cushion, a dark wood side table, or even a tapestry-style wall hanging can add that touch of historical opulence. Focus on a few statement pieces rather than a lot of clutter. A single ornate mirror or a beautifully framed piece of classical art can become a focal point. The spirit of the Renaissance is about celebrating beauty, craftsmanship, and thoughtful design. It's about creating a home that tells a story and inspires you every day. The Renaissance was truly a golden age for interior design, leaving a legacy that continues to influence us centuries later. From the grand frescoes and coffered ceilings to the principles of symmetry and order. The designers of this period created a blueprint for timeless elegance. They showed us that a home can be more than just a shelter. It can be a work of art, a reflection of our values, and a source of daily inspiration. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey back in time. I hope you enjoyed this look inside the magnificent homes of the Renaissance. If you found this interesting, please give this video a thumbs up, and do you and forget to subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into the history of design. Let me know in the comments which historical design period you'd like to explore next. Until then, stay curious,